Hi, I want to go over Ubisoft's performance on Steam over the years. Let's start by talking about Ubisoft a little. So, it was founded in the 80s and they're currently worth over $1 billion and they have over 120 games developed by them on Steam, which were reviewed by more than 3 million accounts. That's a lot of people. They're basically gaming royalty with a lot of very well known titles and franchises to their name, although lately the performance of their games is a topic of debate. They have a huge amount of games spread across multiple very well established franchises, plus even more that aren't in the spotlight most of the time. So here is how many games they released on Steam year by year. These are the games that I could find that were developed by Ubisoft. It doesn't include the games developed by other companies, but published by Ubisoft. Of course, there are a lot of titles that were originally made before 2010, and they were put on Steam in 2010, so that's why there's a huge spike there. Somewhere between 2020 and 2022, Ubisoft stopped publishing games on Steam for a while, though those games came to Steam later. If we take the games and put them across their original release years, the graph looks like this. This is a very busy company, although most of the peaks in this graph is caused by smaller games that aren't as well known as the big franchises. Having this many games on Steam means having a lot of user interaction too. So if we look at franchises by review volume, Rainbow Six franchise makes up a huge chunk of the reviews. I went and looked into this and it is 99% Rainbow Six Siege. It's a multiplayer free-to-play game, so they always get a lot more attention. Since this is only one game, making up such a big portion, it would skew the results a lot, so I decided to remove it from the data altogether. Everything from this point on is excluding Rainbow Six Siege. So our biggest franchises by player interaction are Assassin's Creed and Far Cry, as you would expect. This is how many reviews Ubisoft received yearly for the games developed by them. For such a busy and a big player developer, these numbers aren't that impressive. So to put this into perspective for you, Baldur's Gate 3 got 700k reviews in 2 years. That is a single game getting as much engagement as almost 3 years of all Ubisoft games on its own. And during that time, Ubisoft published multiple very high budget games like Skull and Bones, Assassin's Creed Shadows, Star Wars Outlaws, that Avatar game. So yeah, some people might think comparing it to Baldur's Gate 3 is unfair, but I think it is fair when you are the studio that invented Assassin's Creed. So I'm comparing Ubisoft to Baldur's Gate 3 because I respect Ubisoft a lot and genuinely believe they have game-making skills if they focus on it. This is the graph for daily concurrent players across all Ubisoft titles. Even though Steam and the gaming market are much bigger compared to 2018, Ubisoft is struggling to replicate their peaks from that era. They look like the industry left them behind a little because we should see a big jump here after COVID, but we don't see that. When it comes to average sentiment by release year, it is very apparent that we have a company that's been slipping lately. This graph shows year by year what is the average Steam rating of the games released in that year. So the drop in quality is visible here, and the earlier Ubisoft games basically have higher scores. I grouped games into 5-year release windows, so it is clear to see the change over time. The drop is more clearly visible here. Now, what I just showed you was average game sentiment, so it is important to understand the difference here between average and weighted average. Let's say you have two games. One has 1 million reviews with 100% positive rating. The other has 100,000 reviews with only 20% positive rating. The average of these ratings would be 60% because it is the average of 100% and 20%. However, the weighted average would be 93% because one of them has 10 times more ratings than the other. So in order to be fair and see if there's any nuance there, I wanted to look at the weighted averages of the games as well. Here's the weighted average over the release years. On top of the graph are how they compare to their average. So if the arrow is up, it means that games with smaller review volume drag the average down a little. So we see a lot of up arrows here, which means smaller releases made by Ubisoft drag Ubisoft's overall average down. By smaller release here, I don't mean smaller budget or anything like that. It's just that fewer people played that game. For example, Avatar is probably not a small budget game, but nobody's playing it, right? But it impacts the average because one game is one game. That being said, the trend is still downward, especially in the last 10 years. Again, if we put them into 5-year windows, the downward trend is still visible, and there's no question this company and their franchises and their games are getting worse over time. So let's check out franchises. Like we established before, Assassin's Creed and Far Cry make up a lot of the single-player engagement for Ubisoft on Steam. Together, they make 50% of all reviews. This is the average rating by each franchise. Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and Ghost Recon sit around 80% average rating. These are 3 of the bigger franchises they have, while The Division and Watch Dogs are on the lower side, and these are 2 other big franchises. Rayman sits on top, although it's a very small franchise compared to the rest. I just like seeing it here because I think it is the first game Ubisoft released for Windows, if I'm not mistaken, way back in 1995. Again, I wanted to look at the weighted averages too. It suddenly redeems Valiant Hearts, for example. Turns out the 2014 release of the franchise is a really good game, and it was pulled down by the 2024 release when we looked at the averages. I like how this exercise is teaching me new games like this. The number of up arrows, again, suggests that a lot of these franchises are hurt by their smaller releases. Maybe they don't put as much effort into some games as they do others, I don't know. I think Assassin's Creed and Far Cry sitting above 80% is a very good accomplishment for the company, because making as many games as they do and keeping the fan base happy is not an easy thing to do. Of course, this is the sentiment of the people who played the games. People who outright refused to play aren't included here, for obvious reasons. Let's look at Assassin's Creed. There are few video game franchises as iconic as Assassin's Creed, and a new Assassin's Creed game is always important gaming news. However, not all Assassin's Creed games are created equal. The good games of the franchise kind of come in waves. For example, Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood were very well liked, and Revelation and Assassin's Creed 3 maybe weren't that interesting. Then came Assassin's Creed Black Flag, and it is probably the best pirate game of all time. I stopped playing Assassin's Creed after this game because I kind of got Ubisoft fatigue because I was also playing Far Cry, and the 2 franchises started becoming the same game. But for more than 10 years, I've been turning on sea shanties from this game from time to time. From this point on, as an outsider, I think I can say the next 3 games were forgettable compared to Black Flag. I didn't hear much about them, but like I said, I'm an outsider at this point, so I might be wrong about 1 or 2 of the games. But when Origins and Odyssey came, I think this was the closest I felt like going back to the franchise, but the Ubisoft fatigue was still strong and kept me away from it. But these games obviously were received well. I think this is also the point they changed the formula and started leaning into more RPG style. I'm all for it because I think Ubisoft are at their best when they shake things up and innovate. As an outsider, none of the following releases felt interesting enough to consider for me, maybe Valhalla, but I can say the Steam reviews of these games reflect my opinion about them almost perfectly. That's why I like Steam reviews much better than like professional critics. This is the peak concurrent players of Assassin's Creed games. This cannot be taken at face value as Steam itself has seen like massive growth over the years. So later games have a huge advantage, especially post 2020. Moreover, Valhalla and Mirage weren't even initially released on Steam, so they're at a huge disadvantage. That being said, Origins and Odyssey pulled very impressive numbers for their time. Odyssey having as many Steam players as Assassin's Creed Shadows, despite being released in 2018, is very impressive. Because games naturally have more Steam players now than they did in 2018 because the pie is bigger, right? This shows that although Assassin's Creed Shadows doesn't have an awful rating, people who aren't hardcore fans of the franchise probably just didn't buy the game. I wanted to look at how many people played each Assassin's Creed game last Sunday. It gave really surprising results. The number one game that is getting the most amount of players today is Odyssey, an 8-year-old game. Shadows is the second place game, but barely. And I suspect these aren't the type of games you play again and again. So this could mean Odyssey is still pulling more new players than newer Assassin's Creed games, including Shadows. Let's look at Far Cry 2. So Far Cry 1 wasn't made by Ubisoft, so that's why you don't see it in this chart. The ratings for Far Cry is also clearly dropping with every game. The latest one I played was Far Cry Primal. I quit because of the Ubisoft fatigue I talked about. And in addition to that, Far Cry games also started to feel the same over and over again. But yeah, Far Cry and Assassin's Creed also became the same game with different skins over time for me. Looking at the peak concurrent players, Far Cry 5 has clearly been the biggest of the series. 100k concurrent players in 2018 is a very big number. I think it is because the setting is the United States, if I'm not mistaken, so these numbers are kind of making me want to try Far Cry 5 for myself. And it is reflected in the last Sunday numbers too. So Far Cry 5 has more players than Assassin's Creed Shadows. So 2 8-year-old games are beating Assassin's Creed Shadows in player counts today. So let's jump to conclusions. No matter how you look at it, I think Ubisoft is on a downward trend with the Steam audience, who happens to be almost the entire population of PC gamers. I think this is a result of the company forgetting what made them great. So nowadays the player sentiment is going down, players' numbers are going down, like their big franchises are becoming shadows of themselves. And if you're younger than 30, you might not remember, but Ubisoft used to be a very innovative company. They made Prince of Persia: Sands of Time in 2003, which was unlike anything at the time. I picked it up to play it a little before this video. It is instant fun and a pure video game. You had great parkour and very good puzzles thanks to this parkour system, and it had a pretty fun combat plus a time rewind mechanic that worked really well and was fun to use for the time. And then they made Assassin's Creed in 2007. So the Hidden Blade was very iconic. The parkour built on top of what Prince of Persia created. I think also the premise of the story was also great, but I think they left it later. It was just a big moment in gaming history. I think what's changed is, I think there's a fundamental cycle of being a good single-player video game company. You need to innovate, you need to perfect your games, you need to milk your games, and most importantly, you need to repeat this process. I think Ubisoft fit this formula really well, and to some degree they probably still do because they're not afraid of taking new directions, like changing Assassin's Creed games into RPG games. Back then, when I played the game, Assassin's Creed Black Flag was a great new introduction to the franchise, for example, and because the franchise was starting to feel repetitive at the time. I think innovation is the strongest side of this company, and I think they should be aware of it too and lean into it more. I think Ubisoft have the skill and the legacy to make good games. All they need to do is focus on making games, not money, not politics, not following the trend that someone else set. Ubisoft are at their best when they innovate and lead, not milk and follow. So they need to be just their pure gaming company selves, in my opinion. And they need to try to be the innovator and the leader they have tried to be in the past. I think that's how this company can be saved, by focusing on making games. Thanks for watching.